welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Jay, for those that don't know me, and I'm one of the directors and also one of the co-chairs of the PSA. And my pronouns are they, them. For those who've joined us today or watching the recording back and are new to the PSA, the Proud Science Alliance is a collective of LGBTQ+ networks from across the healthcare and life sciences sector, working together to raise the bar on queer inclusion within our organizations, but also the sector as a whole. And we do that by sharing good practice, of course, and collectively sponsoring programming designed to achieve more together than we could individually. And this session is part of that work. Our quarterly science series, which brings thought leaders from across the life sciences and beyond to share insights that inspire and equip our community. Today is a session called Innovating from the Inside Out: Difference, Identity, and the Science of Innovation. And I'm genuinely excited about the conversation we're about to have. And our speaker, in case you didn't read all about him, is Dr. James Cassena. James is a scientist, entrepreneur, and coach whose career spans the full arc of laboratory research to commercial leadership and people development. James has deep expertise in cell and gene therapy, regenerative medicine, and bioprocess scale-up. And he's also the founder of Reworks, a coaching and consulting venture helping individuals and organizations unlock clarity and sustainable performance. He's the Royal Academy of Engineering SHOT Scale-Up Accelerator awardee, holds executive education credentials from Oxford Said Business School and Harvard, and serves as a visiting lecturer at UCL. An openly queer Black man who has navigated science, entrepreneurship, and leadership across multiple contexts, James brings both rigorous evidence and, really importantly, lived experience to everything he does. So over the next hour, James is going to share his personal reflections on innovation, identity, and what it means to bring your whole self into the rooms where science and leadership happens. And I'll be joining him a little bit in conversation as we go, and we'll open up things for your questions and also reflections. But please make sure you use the chat function throughout the session today to engage with us and each other throughout our time together. So let's begin. And with that, I'll hand over to James.
Wonderful. Thank you for the introduction, Jay. And thank you everyone for joining today. I'm gonna share my screen, which hopefully you can all see now. I'm just gonna move here. Can you see my screen? Okay, perfect. So I guess I want to start by kind of going back about 4 years ago. I was at a conference, at a cell and gene therapy event, and I'd introduced myself, my role, the work that I was doing, the company I was leading and working for, and that information was in the room. I spoke about bridging science and commercialization strategy, which was the whole point of that session. And afterwards, someone came up to me and said, "Oh, wow, you're so articulate." It wasn't said unkindly, and I know that, and I know it was meant as a compliment, but there's something that struck me. I was already in the room. I had already spoken. That information was there. They just, I guess, hadn't processed it through the right filter yet. And I think that's one of the things that I want to explore and talk about today. It's not the moment itself, but the filter, where it comes from, and also what it costs us as a community, as a society, and what actually becomes possible when we update it. But I also want to say that filter wasn't just in that room only. That filter was also one that I was carrying my own version of. I'd learned how, it was a filter I was using in how I'd learned to see myself and also how to describe myself. So that's something that's really important. And I want to start with something that I guess I had underestimated for a long time. As Jay kindly said at the beginning, my career has taken me from a laboratory bench to biotech operations, scale-up entrepreneurship, and now I'm in the organizational design, operations, and people development side of things. And for a long time, I described that as a non-linear path, which it is, but it was as if the different directions were something that I needed to explain. Now I don't think of it in that way. In fact, I see it more as every single one of those transitions is something that I had to do. And each of those transitions required me to do the same thing. And that was to see a problem from an angle that no one else in the room was seeing it from. And also to translate across different domains that usually don't speak to each other. And also importantly, to hold two apparently contradictory truths or things at the same time, and often have to find a third option that, hadn't typically been considered. So all of that was not despite of my identity. That is my identity. It's what I've always done. There are many elements to me as a person in my intersectionality. I am a Black, queer, cis man, born in Africa, raised in the UK, and I've navigated scientific research, commercial leadership, entrepreneurship, and often in rooms where nobody else looked quite like me or held the same combination of things that I was holding. And I think that navigation builds over the years and over different contexts a very specific set of like cognitive muscles. For instance, I think you learn to read rooms quickly because you have to. You learn to translate situations because, no one else is doing it for you. And you also develop that ability to hold contradiction because typically the contradiction is actually where you have always lived, right? And it took me a while to find the right language for what that actually produces. Um, because I don't think the word that we typically use quite covers it. And I think that comes into what we're talking about today. And we're talking about innovating from the inside out, talking about difference, identity, and the science of innovation. So let me be specific about something. When I say innovation, I want to be precise because I think we often conflate two things. We've got invention, which is creating something new. And then we have innovation, which is creating new value, often from things that often already exist, things that are combined or applied in ways nobody has tried before. And that's what I think is amazing about innovation is it is essentially this divergent thinking that leads to solutions and advancements, and it requires us to see things in ways that other people don't. So the question, and stay with me here, is where does that ability actually come from? Because if it comes from, at least in part, from navigating differences, learning to hold multiple truths at once, then typically the people most practiced at innovative thinking are not the ones that organizations normally think they are. Okay. So the reason why I say stay with me is because, this isn't just a feeling that I have. There's a lot of growing research that is out there, and I think it's very compelling. So we look at things that are coming out of different fields of research. For instance, this work in PNS that talks about how uh, scientists are significantly being more novel in terms of their output. So they asked a direct question: do scientists from underrepresented backgrounds produce more scientific or novel output? And the answer is yes, measurably so as well. On standards of novelty in scientific output, researchers from minoritized backgrounds consistently scored higher. But the study also went on to show something else that was really, really important that they called a paradox. Those exact same researchers also experience slower career progression. So they have less recognition, they've got greater barriers to advancement. So they offer more innovative input, but they've got slower advancement. So the system is extracting the value of the innovation, but actually limiting the people who produce it. In another sense, we've got a survey that was done of over 25,000 STEM professionals across 21 different professional societies. It found that typically LGBTQ plus scientists were significantly more likely to experience workplace harassment and career obstacles compared to their non-LGBTQ plus colleagues or counterparts. And that's 25,000 people across 21 different societies. That's not a marginal finding. That's something that's quite significant. And I want to name that this is not just an innovation cost, it's also a human one as well. Every time someone who sees the world differently is pushed out, or simply just not fully heard, that is a problem in the sector that we don't solve, because the person who might have solved it is no longer in the room. And I think that's a great shame and something that we need to be figuring out how we can do more about it. And finally, I'll share this one. In analysis of 6.6 million published medical papers, there was research that found that gender diverse teams produce more novel work that is more highly cited, more novel, more cited, 6.6 million papers. So diversity isn't a value statement. It's actually something that is around a performance variable that we can toggle in our own to our own benefits to actually get better performances from our organization. So here is what the evidence and my own experience tell me. It tells me that we're dealing with not one problem, but with two. So the first problem is that people from communities of difference typically are not making it into the right teams, the right rooms, the right conversations, or at least not in sufficient numbers. So the pipeline has structural gaps that don't fix themselves. The second problem is being heard once you're in there. Even if people get in, even if they're on the panel, they're at the table, they're leading the project, the filter is still running, their credibility is assessed differently to other people. Their expertise is processed maybe a bit more slow or through a different lens. The articulate statement is not an outlier, it's just a filter that's made more audible. So I think really both of these problems are real. Both of them have innovation costs. And I think it's important that we name them separately because they actually require different responses, because getting more people into the room solves problem number one, but it doesn't actually solve or automatically solve problem number two. So the question I often find myself sitting with, and I generally don't have an answer for it, is what is the actual scientific cost? Not the human cost, because that is a real one and it matters as well. But as scientists, as people in spaces where we should be innovating, what is the innovative cost to these problems? And the problems that we aren't solving because of this, because the people who should be in those places are not fully in the room, or if they're in the room, they're not being fully heard. So I think it brings us to a point where we really need to be thinking, how can we do better and what can we do to ensure that we're bringing everyone to the table so that in these endeavors, which have the abilities to send people to space, to go around the moon, to treat cancers, to purify water, all of these amazing things that we can do, how can you actually do that in a way that brings the best minds together and actually tap into that potential, into that knowledge? So one thing that I want to leave you with is something that hopefully you can be able to use, which is, whatever role you're in, whatever organization you're in, I think the first question shouldn't be, how do I become more innovative? It should be, where do I already see differently? And am I actually using that? So let's tap into ourselves first to be that first small unit of change that makes that ripple effect. So, most of us have different experiences. We've got our own personal identities or histories that give us a vantage point that others around us don't necessarily share. We often spend a lot of time managing those differences, translating, softening things, code switching, rather than actually leveraging those differences. And for those people who lead other people, who shape culture, or who design how work happens, psychological safety is not a value statement, it's a structural condition, because you don't get minority innovation capacity without it. That capacity doesn't disappear when safety is absent. It just doesn't show up in your organization. It shows up elsewhere, or it actually doesn't show up at all. So in this kind of little intro, I don't have a tidy conclusion to everything, and I'm hoping that we can discuss more of this in the conversation. But what I have is this: the things that made me different, the things I've spent years learning to navigate and sometimes hide, are the things that have allowed me to actually see around the corner, to connect things that other people don't, to build things that other people said couldn't be. And I worked really hard to get into those right rooms, and I worked even harder to be heard in them. And that experience is certainly not unique to me at all. And what it represents is not just a diversity problem, it's also an innovation problem. The two are not in competition with each other. They're actually the same problem, just from very different angles. And I think it's important to see that the gap that the research tells us is there, which is that difference drives innovation, and then compare that with how organizations actually behave, how they recruit, who they listen to, and whose ideas typically get resourced. That's where the gap is. That's where the cost lives. And something that I've really come to believe is that, from everything that I've experienced and everything that I've done and seen, inclusion isn't the soft side of science, it's the infrastructure to innovation. When people genuinely feel that they are there to contribute and that they actually can contribute, that's when the most important discoveries get made. That's when a field moves forward. And now that's why I've built, the work I'm doing now around doing exactly that, helping individuals understand what they bring as their full authentic selves, and also helping organizations to create conditions that actually use those unique capabilities. So it's not a nice to have, it's actually a fundamental capacity for any sort of organization that's looking to innovate to have. So going into our discussion, the question that I have is, what does innovation mean for you in the organization that you're in? And what would it look like to pursue it more intentionally, starting with what you already bring? So, yeah, thank you for listening to that intro. And yeah, let's open it up to a discussion. And I look forward to hearing what everyone else thinks.
Thanks so much for that. And I think it's laying down the foundation, as you suggest, for a conversation now. And just to let everyone know, please do maybe raise your hand so we know you have a question using the raise hand function at the top bar of the screen there. And 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 also, certainly, if you don't feel comfortable for whatever reason asking a question live, you can just type it into the chat and we'll go from there. But why don't I kick it off? I mean, so much of what you described resonates, because not just through my personal experience, having worked in a life science organization, but even reaching back into graduate school and that sort of thing. But then also, like working as a coach and in the people side of things, and then being active and in the inclusion space on some level as well. You start to hear stories of other people and that sort of thing. I mean, I guess what I'm curious about is that there, as you rightly point out, there isn't necessarily a solution, maybe because we wouldn't be here, let's say. But I think maybe what would be interesting is to hear a little bit more about your personal experience. And sometimes it's helpful too to bring in stories of other people that draws out some of the themes. You started off with a story, for example, but yeah, are there others that sort of those main themes that you keep hearing over and over again? Maybe is a place to start.
Yeah, so I think I I think often there's a lot of talk that gets internalized that then stops people from actually doing things that they inherently know they have the capacity to do, but
Mm,
then the environment doesn't necessarily allow it to for that to
mm,
happen. So
yeah.
a lot of the work that I do kind of is very holistic in its approach, where I look at, for instance, in coaching or in organizational development, we look at
Mm,
the individual, but also the environment, because those
mm,
two things are really important and they have to come together. So
mm,
often the story that you hear when you're speaking to people, and especially if you've created that psychological safety and that environment, people are actually going to share. The stories you often
mm,
hear is frustration of, I
mm,
know how we should be doing this. It's just no one
mm,
listens to me. Or I try time and time again and I just don't get listened to. And it is sad, but it is
mm,
typically minoritized people where those
mm,
stories are typically coming from. I've seen it in organizations that I've stepped into and helped, etc. I've seen it in my own personal experience where there's just a filter, like I said, that just gets
mhm,
applied. And it's something that is very difficult to dismantle, but it's something that we cannot
Mhm.
not do. And I
Mhm.
think that's the important thing, because like I said, and
Mhm.
kind of the point I was trying to create to make in that opening was, it's only by bringing all of these different aspects of every
Mhm.
single person who's part of that team can we actually benefit, right? Because
Yeah.
typically we're hiring people or bringing a team together because they should be bringing something. It's such a great shame if you're not allowing them to bring those things. So yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And is there any, I mean, maybe speaking from personal experience too, but have you noticed anything that kind of works? Because I agree. Sometimes you get in the room and you're like feeling the frustration. And I've kind of experimented probably more intuitively about how to move past that. What the stories that I tend to hear are more like I work harder, longer hours. I kind of do stuff outside of work to prove and things that can work, but it creates this additional burden, to move past the barrier, so to speak. And sometimes that doesn't even work. But in the
Mhm.
moment, how do you typically, of course, we have those moments of frustration, but have you found anything that particularly works for you where you can move beyond those filters, let's say?
I think it goes back to the environment. So, well, no, there's two things I'll say. One is intentionality is a really important part of it. And by that, I mean, if you are going to say we are an inclusive organization, if you're going to say we want to listen to people, actually be intentional about it and actually do something with that. So if you're being intentional with it, it means you look at your team, right? And you look who's contributing, who's not. You understand why they're contributing or not. And then you go and try and fix with the assistance of the people who are being affected by whatever it is that is
Mm-hmm.
happening, to create that right environment, that right system. So it may be because someone likes to receive information in a different way. It may be because someone doesn't feel comfortable speaking in a certain room. So
Mm-hmm.
you're making sure that you're addressing those things not in the way that you think is best for you, because we all carry our own different privileges. And the way I filter things or the way I see things is not necessarily going to be the best way to solve that issue for
Mm-hmm.
someone else. And that's where the intentionality comes in, because it's hard work. You have to do it. You have to put in the effort. That might mean sometimes you're pre-prepping certain people for a meeting so that when they come in, they feel ready to be able to contribute. So it's
Mm-hmm.
that intentionality that's really important. But alongside with that is the environment. Yet again, the environment has to be right for people to do that. So if you've done
Mm-hmm.
all of that pre-prep, someone knows what's going to be coming in the meeting, they want to contribute, but then for whatever reason, that environment that they're in, they're afraid of any sort of prejudice or judgment that may happen because of previous experience, rightly or wrongly. That again is still going to stifle all of the things that you've tried to do. So again, it's
Mm-hmm.
that holistic approach of bringing the two elements together, of the specificity of the individual and the context you're working in, but also the environmental structural conditions to bring in that safety.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I want to carry on with this just a little bit before we get into some other questions, because I think it's really um, important to have a bit of a discussion around this, because I think one of the things that you're describing as well is that that triggered me to think for myself, what did I do? And I think part of it is having a realistic or pragmatic view of like, this is this is the situation, and I can't really, in this moment, I can't shift it, so, and I see the barriers or obstacles, and there's typically, I'll just give two examples and see if this resonates with you and your experience. But one is just to say, what is the outcome that I really care about? And it's not necessarily just for me. It could be
Mhm,
a project or kind of moving something forward. And then we get into somebody else is going to take credit for the idea, or somebody speaks up and basically says what you say, is usually what we hear, and saying, that's fine. I recognize, and it's not going to, I'm not going to shift anything by saying, hey, wait a minute, stop. That was my idea, but allow it
mhm,
to kind of go forward and think, I see what's happening. I'm going to clock that, but I'm just going to let it go because I'd rather the project move forward. And
mhm,
that's not
mhm.
the ideal situation, because
Yeah.
yeah, so you're kind of supporting innovation, let's say, in this context,
Mhm.
in that way. Then the other thing is that I guess outside the context of a project or work is what I've noticed quite powerfully is what you demonstrated today is teller stories. It's like showing
Mhm.
up both proactively and kind of, and this is largely what we do within the PSA too, creating space for people to tell their stories, but within organizations, I've seen the power of doing that as well. I'm not a natural speaker, or I wasn't, I kind of learned that, but part of it is recognizing that given the opportunity, I need to take it and talk about my experience to help shift the mindset, helping
Yeah.
create the environment that you're describing. And part of that is saying, I'm affected. This is why, and so maybe in the moment, but what you're creating as an environment. Yeah, so those are a couple of examples of pragmatic things that happen.
Absolutely.
One that's like, well, this isn't ideal. The other feels more proactive, and you're like kind of helping to create the environment maybe that you want to work, or in the long run is going to help other people. But yeah, does that resonate with your work and what you've experienced?
Yeah, absolutely. So with your second point, that firstly, yes, I think we have to be rooted down in the
Mhm.
pragmatic reality that we're in, right?
Mhm.
I'm a big believer of acceptance and just being like, this is the reality that I'm existing in, and then what shall I do and how do I move forward? So absolutely, I couldn't agree more with that. And to your second point, I think that really lands into that idea of self-leadership, starting
Mhm.
with that self-leadership and allowing that to ripple outward. So
Mhm.
be the leader that you want, be the example that
Mhm.
you want to see, and making those steps so that that hopefully then becomes something that other people see and model. You don't have to be in a leadership position, because I
Mhm.
think often behave ideally, and also often the behaviors that are really good and actually make a difference to other people are things that other people are going to try and emulate as well. I'm
Mhm.
not saying that's always the case, of course, but typically in a fairly decent, well-functioning organization, that's what's going to happen. And then in terms of your first point, I think, yeah, absolutely. There's especially for leaders, right? I think we have to be looking for what is the greater good that we're trying to achieve, and being able to
Mhm.
actually give that space for the innovation, for the work, for the client to be the priority is really, really important. And I say that with a caveat that it should never come at the expense of you as a person. But I
Mhm.
think we also should definitely be like, what's actually worth my time and what am I trying to achieve here? And what I
Mhm.
think, especially in those moments, is to recognize what's happened and to see the moment where you're thinking, oh, okay, well, that's happened, but actually for the benefit of this is what needs to be done. But absolutely, what I encourage, feedback is key. Speak to the people who need to know that that is the reality of what's happened. Be like, oh, by the way, in that meeting, X, Y, and Z, I also wanted to say that, or et cetera, because you still need to allow yourself to be proactive and to take responsibility of
Mhm.
getting yourself heard as well. Typically, no one else is going to do that for you. So I think understanding the context and the environment that you're in and being like, okay, I just need things to move forward, but also holding people accountable
Yeah.
when appropriate is important.
What a great point, to add on in a way, because I think you're right. I tend to be quite gobby, is the way I would describe it. And it's like I can't help myself sometimes. It's like if I sense a bit of injustice or I see it, primarily if it happens to me because I experienced it, then I feel able, but also this sort of obligation, to say,
Mhm.
maybe not in the moment, but later, as you suggest, saying that wasn't right. And let me tell you
Yeah.
why, and kind of talk
Yes.
about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And
Absolutely. Absolutely.
yeah, and fortunately, I personally haven't experienced that too much, but I think I have, and know people that I have. The other thing that I wanted to bring in is that a lot of the people that we interact with are part of big multinationals.
Mhm.
Not that it doesn't happen in smaller organizations, but there's always a lot of change, and the impact is organizational changing and leadership shifts. And I've experienced it, but I've also seen it where a team might function really healthily and and inclusive, and every voice matters, that sort of thing. Whereas a slight shift or a new leader comes and things changed. And so I think the point that I was thinking of is, as you described, when you create the space for yourself and you're kind of in the room and you're accepted, and that can shift, and you're like, oh, I got to deal with this again, and kind of almost push to have the same experience, or create an environment, and that can be a bit disheartening, I think, and frankly tiresome,
Hmm.
over time, or makes you a bit weary. I
Hmm.
think, but
Yeah.
I wonder if you've experienced that or noticed it as well in your work.
Yes, I have, and it's not just in big organizations; it's also in small organizations and startups as
Mm,
well. Which is more the
mm,
space I work in, and in that case, it manifests itself in the sense that typically a startup, you have that vision, that goal that you're going for. But I always often say founders in early stage startups are like magpies. They're attracted to the shiny
mm.
thing. And that often means
Mm,
that, you're typically kind of like experiencing whiplash by like, okay, our priority is this, our priority is that,
mhm,
and that is really difficult for people to have to navigate. And yeah, it becomes burdensome, it becomes tiresome. And I think one of the core things that I talk about in the work that I do is clarity. Clarity is kindness,
mm,
and it's bringing people along that journey. And I think one of the elements of organizations that people, I feel, don't actually give enough importance to is change management. And I'm not
mm,
talking necessarily in its fully official kind of like capacity of the processes, etc. That's important, yes, but actually the human element of it, of you have to realize we're dealing with people, and naturally as humans, we don't like uncertainty,
mhm,
right? We want to know what's
mhm,
going on. A little goes a long way in terms of like, hey everyone, like we may be having some changes, just as a heads up, this is what's happening, or we're in a
mm,
very turbulent space right now.
mm,
The next 3 4 months we're going to maybe be trying different things, bear with us,
mm,
and bringing people along the journey as much as you can. Of course, sometimes you can't give all the information away,
mhm.
but I think
Yeah.
that's the core thing, is like, think about the fact that at the end of whatever board meeting, exec meeting that you're having, those decisions are impacting people, right? And
Mm,
those people
mm,
are going to impact the performance of your organization. So really think about, how are we going to do that? I've been in situations where, an exec team basically decides, oh, we're going to do a restructure. And then they're basically telling their team, oh, next week, Monday, you're going to have a different manager. Can you
yes.
imagine like going from like, okay, wait, what does that even mean? Who am I reporting to? What do you
Right.
mean? What's my job? Like, all of these questions, and
Yeah.
someone doesn't have that time to sit with it and process it. It's
Mm,
difficult. And yeah, and I think it's absolutely important. And more so right now, right? Because I think there's almost not a single day that I go on LinkedIn or open some sort of news outlet and there's a layout, or say layoffs and
mhm,
redundancies being announced. That means the average person right now in any organization, big and small, is thinking, well, we had rounds of redundancies last month or six
yeah.
months ago. When is it going to be me, right? So actually speaking to the people in our teams to actually ensure that we're creating again that environment that allows
Mhm,
people to feel as safe as possible. I don't believe in anything around job security, because we don't know what's going to happen. We can't predict the future.
right.
But in the moments that we're in, we have to just be as open and as transparent as possible, and really again consider the person
Mhm.
that's at the other side of that conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, because what it made me think of is, connecting back to what you were talking about, is identity as one
Mhm.
part of how we show up at work. And if there's any indication that there is a reluctance, for me as a person to be accepted in my fullness, not just,
Mhm.
it's okay. It's okay, if you're here. In fact, we're glad
Yeah.
you're around the table. Yet the behaviors indicate, as you suggest, sometimes it's like, but we don't want to hear you, or we choose not to, for whatever
Mhm.
reason. Um,
Mhm.
and I think if you kind of have that in the back of your mind, plus the volatility that we often experience within organizations too, and that anxiety that comes along with that, even if it's low key, then
Yeah.
yeah, so it's those things. And I think one of the things that's really standing out is that leaders, or those that have any kind of capacity to lead within a team or a group, we have a more critical role, and kind of noticing, but also sharing information, that sort
Mhm.
of thing, and creating the safety, as best we can, for people to be there and to contribute. And yeah, and I think as we continue to go through change, but we want innovation, we have to make sure that, we kind of carry people with us as we go through,
Yeah.
so that isn't necessarily broken.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think just to add a quick point on that, innovation
Mhm.
requires change. So we have to be really good at navigating
Mm,
that, because without that
yeah.
ability to accept the change and to sit in a somewhat comfortable ambiguity that feels structurally supported is really, really
Mhm.
important for us to create. Those are the environments that we need to have, because if we're stuck in our ways, we're not innovating. If we're not willing to change, we're not
Mm,
innovating. So it's its own sort of
mm,
paradox, right? So we need
yeah.
that ability to navigate change for us to actually be able to innovate.
Yeah. Yeah. And with that, what I wanted to bring in is because that this comes up periodically as well within the Proud Science Alliance. Of course, we're focused around the sector of life sciences and healthcare, and largely we interact with scientists, but within those organizations are people like with jobs that I used to do, and where you've kind of moved into, people who do finance, procurement,
Mhm,
all kinds of stuff, and some of whom are probably on the call today. And I was just curious from your perspective or any advice, when we think about innovation, particularly in this context, people are like, oh, it's
mhm.
the science and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But thoughts about ways that we can all take, I guess, consider, this idea of innovation and what it means wherever we happen to be.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is actually, that invention, excuse me. So i- i- invention is creating something new, a compound, a
Mm,
new product. Yes, potentially that's science specific, but not exclusively so, right? But innovation is creating new value from something that already exists. And that happens everywhere. It's the HR
mm,
person who redesigns an onboarding workflow so that people from different backgrounds can actually feel like they can contribute from day one. That's
mm,
innovation, right? It changes what the organization can do. It's the finance person who spots a resource allocation methodology or pattern that nobody else saw, and that becomes a way in which you're innovating and asking different questions. Or, it's someone who works in operations will identifies a workflow and sees, how can we unlock this bottleneck that no one else was seeing, because, we were all too close to it. That in itself is also innovation. So I think, the question is always the same, regardless of your function.
mm,
It's what do others what is it that others don't see that you do see,
mm,
and what action can you take upon it? So the discipline might change, but the question doesn't. So I think, innovation is not something, it's the same with creativity, right? It's often
mm,
some people are like, oh, I'm a scientist, I'm not creative, or oh, I'm just not a creative person. And it's like, no, how are you looking at it? Because it,
mm,
it manifests itself in very different ways. So innovation isn't exclusively for a certain group of people. It's something that
mm.
all of us can tap into.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. And I think there's a connection. We've had conversations, probably not specifically, but certainly integrated into the different sessions we've had about the experience of being queer in particular, but also across your intersectional identity, about how, and some of the research that you shared today kind of speaks to that, where a lot of times we have a different experience, or we often have to navigate a world that isn't necessarily always set up for us. And so we get creative
Mhm,
about how we move through
mhm,
life in its
mhm.
simplest terms. And I think that shows up. And as you say, it
Yeah,
is part of our identity, and
yeah.
it's not just something that we can strive to do, or even sometimes choose to do. It's about
Yeah.
how do we, and then honoring that part of ourselves almost, But
Yeah.
I think that's a good summary. But anything else to say about that? Because I have another question.
No, I think yeah, I echo what you said.
Okay. Um, Also, I'm noticing that we're kind of dominating this conversation, but it's like so incredibly interesting to talk to you about this sort of stuff. And just to reiterate, if you have a question or want to come in, even with a reflection, we'd love to hear from anyone on the call. Yeah, just raise your hand or just come off mute and just interrupt us. It's fine. We won't mind. Yeah. So one one of the things that certainly at GSK where I used to work, they always used to make this comparison, like GSK is so big, it's so, it's massive and it moves so slowly. We have to think more like a biotech, and they restructured and everything at one point to try and to do that. But I think, and sometimes that can be a barrier in terms of our own thinking or belief system. It's like,
Mhm.
ah, you know, it's impossible,
Yeah.
to do that.
Yeah.
Thoughts maybe on how to, and you've touched on this already, but any thoughts about that particular mindset and barrier as people would describe it?
Yeah, I think taking that sort of, large organization context, I think the first thing I'd say is that,
Mm,
when it comes to kind of that more innovative thinking or that change within the remit of your organization and the work you're doing, of course, I think you should really kind of try to be that catalyst of change, right? So
mm,
large organizations inherently are slow, which is why, companies like Pfizer, GSK, etc., do try to have those, mini hubs of like innovation, those innovation centers, etc. And that's important, and the reason behind that is because actually the large organization is slow at a system level, but each of those, that system is
mhm,
made up of different teams, and in those teams there's different projects and rooms, and in that sort of more chunked down version is where we can start to make the change, because that's where we can have a lot more speed, a lot more
mhm,
senses of urgency and impact
mhm,
be seen more quickly. So it's thinking about, in the context that I'm in, what is the smallest unit of change that's available to me? Not the whole organization,
mhm,
but actually in the team that I'm in the project that you're leading, in the
mhm,
conversation you're about to have, what is the thing that you can have? And then that is usually the catalyst that allows us to think, how do we approach something differently? How do we
mhm,
innovate from that? So yes, we can have a top-down mandate around innovation,
mhm,
but that's not really how it's going to happen. It's actually
mhm,
because it's going to happen because people are feeling like, okay, I have that autonomy and that sense of urgency to bring in that different perspective and to also try something different and see what happens. But again, the environment has to allow for that to be the case.
Yeah, yeah, and thanks Bex for the comment. What is the smallest unit of change? They say I love that, and I sort of agree in a way, because sometimes it can feel a little bit overwhelming. Like, whew, if you think about queer inclusion in a workplace, you're like,
Mhm.
whew, how do we solve that? How do we
Yeah.
solve that? But in this moment, in this conversation, or within my team, or in this on the site where I work or whatever, you can make choices, I suppose. But yeah, and there was something there that I was gonna follow on from. Um, I think it's recognizing that as we kind of talk about it, it's like, for example, what is the smallest of change, and be the change. I
Mhm.
don't want to move away from the fact that sometimes it's really difficult. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but I'm curious from your perspective, what are either experiences that you've had or that you've noticed or observed, because I think some of the practicality comes in then through the story. This is what I did, or this is what others did to move past that. I'll let you go and then maybe add on to that. But yeah, what is some practical advice, when people are like, oh, just I'm getting pushback, or it's not working as well as I thought, or I'm tired. I don't know.
Mhm. I think so. it so you take that small unit of change, you be the change that you want to be, but also I think especially in organizations and in workplaces, we have to remember what environment we're in, right?
Mm,
And typically we're in an organization that has a set of objectives or something it's trying to achieve. So we have to be also thinking, is that small unit of change and the change that I want to make actually beneficial or in alignment and congruent with what this
mm,
organization is trying to achieve? Because if
mm,
it's not, it almost doesn't matter how innovative or how great
mm,
it is because it just doesn't align with what the people are trying to achieve.
mm,
So in that regard, and I'm not saying it's easy, but this is where you have to start to think, am I in the right environment for the type of
mm,
work and the type of, impact I want to have? And
mm,
if not, with the right sort of support, etc., figuring out, how do I go get into something? And sometimes that's not necessarily leaving a whole organization. It's sometimes
mm,
changing teams. It's sometimes looking for mentors or peers that are more, receptive to the ideas that you have and having those
mhm,
sort of like sponsors for your ideas. And then I think the other thing is if the things that you're trying to make an impact or have the change in are in alignment with the organization, again, it's an organization, it's a business, it's an objective. Some of these larger organizations have, even smaller ones, have shareholders that they need to appease or boards,
mhm,
etc. So it's thinking about bring the data.
mhm,
If you have the data, we're scientists. If you have the
mhm,
data and the data isn't lying, then it's like, well, this is why we should do this. This is why it's impactful because it's having X, Y, and Z impact on whatever metric that it is, that unit of change that you're trying to do is, if it's okay, an example is we one of the teams that I was in charge of, someone basically created this amazing um inventory system that used like a barcoding with our project management team. And like I was amazed with how she did it. And she went around and kind of like did almost like a beta test of it and basically did it with a few different things
mhm,
and be like, well, actually, this is
mhm,
how it's going to work. And it's going to help the operations team because when I scan the thing, it brings up something on their board that then means that they know exactly what to order. So we're not having back and forth. And then we can. So when you
mm,
have that in front of you, it's like, well, of course, this
mhm,
makes sense. We should definitely
mm,
do that, right? And again, that's innovation
mhm,
of that's cross-functional. Was a scientist that was doing something that was going to help people within different departments within
mm,
the organization using tools that were already there. We didn't have to spend any extra money, but it actually had an impact. So when you have the data or you have that, uh, prototype of whatever it is that you're trying to achieve, that can sometimes be a really good way of having that buy-in. So I think
mm.
that's important, having the data, and also most importantly, making sure it's in alignment with the organization that you're within, or the team or the project or whatever it is that you're in.
Yeah, sound advice. And I think the maybe one or two things I would add is that again, not everybody's able to do this, but I don't like no for an answer, especially when you know it's a good idea. And so, and the way I would describe it is like sometimes the door closes, but there's always a window, or you walk around the corner, there's another door, or it's like, there's always a way in, and I think and I've certainly used that effectively on occasion, I just kind of wore the leader down and they're like, okay, okay, fine. And then they're like, gosh, this was a good idea. I'm glad we chose to do that. Because you believe in something so strongly. I think the other one is finding a path that's less resistant. So I think you touched on this, is just finding a sponsor or somebody who is like, oh, I love that idea, and like, and then creates an opportunity where you can test something out potentially, or and then kind of grow from there. And there was one other one was no, not necessarily another one, but I liked what you said, about like sometimes you have to say, that's my line. And, it's like, or it's kind of crossed because I'm not able to work as effectively as I want to. And it is okay to say, that's okay. I'll
Yeah,
go someplace else.
yeah,
Mine
yeah.
always was, triggered by, is this fun? And am I
Hmm.
learning? Am I working with inspiring people?
Hmm.
And when that kind
Hmm.
of fell apart, I was like, it's time,
Yeah. Yeah.
to
Yeah.
go do something else and kind of reignite. And the other thing that you touched on too, I think, and maybe this is a good place to end in a way, because I think what you're describing is that, particularly from, I sense, at least in my coaching practice and such, people from communities of difference, we tend to carry an emotional burden, or there's more emotional labor associated with showing up and like being seen, being heard, and that sort of thing, and also having the sometimes obligation to teach people a little
Yeah.
bit, about being more open and inclusive.
Mhm.
And what I tend to work on, I've had to work on this myself, is having people around me, so groups or individuals. So when I get tired or a bit exhausted or frustrated or that sort of thing, I can always turn to somebody and say, and they're like, "You're amazing. Let me remind you." And you're like, "Oh, okay." Because right now I don't feel it. I'm not
Mhm.
feeling
Mhm.
the love from this team or this project or whatever the case may be. But what's your experience with that in particular? Do you have a good
I-
network of people around you?
Yeah, I think it's so important to have that. And so I'll say two things. One, I think it's so
Mm,
important to have that, and I think it's what makes work so rewarding at times. And we have to think, for most of us, work is such a huge part of our lives.
mm,
We spend a lot of time there physically, whether you're working remotely
mm,
or not, but also mentally. Even when you've left your
mm,
desk or your laptop, it's still there. There's residual elements of it. So it's really important for that to be as good of an environment and thing to be processing and to have and to hold. So yeah, absolutely, having those people that help motivate you, that help to kind of champion you on with things is so, so important. And that's something that I have always tried to create. And I think that's
mm,
why, when done well, employee resource groups, that's what they're trying to
mhm,
achieve. It's creating that network of people
mhm,
within an environment that help to, build each other up, because it shouldn't be just your burden. It's not one person's
mm,
responsibility to try and do those things. If we are all doing a little bit, that, the sum of all the parts become greater, right?
mm,
Um, and the second thing I'll say, and it touches upon the point that you're talking about, that time to make a change. I think it's really important. And I know it's not always easy, because, the job market is not necessarily always great. And,
mhm,
we're not always ready for change and things like that. But I think if you have to figure out what's important for you. But if being somewhere that feeds you and gives you
mhm,
excitement and energizes is a value to you and something that's important,
mhm,
don't be afraid to have that conversation. And I encourage both people within my teams, or people that I've managed, or people that I'm working with, to say, if the
mhm.
time is no longer working, let's move apart amicably. Let's help you
Right.
transition to where you need to be. And also, it's typically done well to everyone's benefit, because you're not having all of a
Absolutely.
sudden, oh, I'm leaving in 2 months' time. You actually have that time to transition. You can help to hire your replacement. You
Mhm,
have a much smoother time with it. And I think it's not going to happen everywhere, but I know a lot
mhm,
of places where people are happy with that, because often we are all tiptoeing, especially in the UK
mm.
context, where we might not necessarily always say what we're trying to say, and we're trying to be polite, but actually it's more detrimental
Yeah.
to everyone. So I think it's really important to have that ability to have, again, the sponsor or the person who you speak to in confidence when you're ready to say, this
Mm,
is where I'm at. And potentially someone be like, oh, what are the blockers in your way that are making you do
mhm,
that? Because we think you're a valuable part of the team. Or it
mhm,
might be, actually, yeah, in the last few months with the direction that we're going with the organization, yeah, I can see why you may be
mhm.
feeling that. Let's see what else might work for you. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we will end it there, but what you reminded me of is almost coming back full circle, in a sense that part of it is showing up as ourselves, and but feeling really confident in that. And I've been obsessing, but also meditating on this song that I've been listening to over and over again. And the opening, for the past probably month or two, and the opening line is, before the world told you who you are, before the world told you who you were already enough." And I think that's something that to end with, because I think this is in some ways the heart of what we're talking about today. When we think about innovation and that sort of thing, we can get a bit discouraged, I suppose, thinking, no, my ideas aren't that great, or I'm trying to do something that's supposed to help and that sort of thing, but I'm being told, to be quiet, or that it, later or something, that sort of thing. But actually, coming back to ourselves and saying, actually, no, my voice does matter. And but and thanks for being a representative of that today and sharing your voice and your stories with us today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for inviting me in for a very wonderful conversation. Always a pleasure.
Good. And thanks everyone for joining today and listening to our conversation. Hopefully it was helpful and interesting. Thanks for the feedback there, Bex. And I'm glad it was good for you. And we'll see everyone soon. Take care. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.